He tied me to the oak in my own front yard. He smashed my phone like he was cutting the last string to the outside world. And he smiled the way small men smile when they think fear is obedience. 90 seconds later, the sky belonged to Rotor Wash and the street belonged to people who carry jurisdiction in their pockets. And if you're wondering how we got from a quiet Saturday to black SUVs fanning out across the cul-de-sac, well, sit with me a minute because I still feel the rope sometimes when I shut my eyes and listen to birds that sound like normal life. I had been a homeowner for exactly an hour. The moving truck gone the last box labeled kitchen sitting, where sunlight made it look like possibility instead of work. And I wore a simple black sundress with little white flowers I had stitched up the week before as a gift to myself. A promise that this new house meant new rules for how I would be treated and how I would treat myself. You know what I mean when you stand on a porch and breathe in cut grass and think, maybe this time I can exhale all the way. The street was hushed in that suburban way, sprinklers ticking a lawnmower far off a child's laugh riding the air like a kite. And then a voice broke it heavy with the kind of authority you can smell a voice that announces itself before it introduces itself. "You must be the new owner," he said, feet planted too wide on the property line like he'd paid for both sides. Cargo shorts, faded polo skin baked to that angry pink. Some men carry like a badge, and then he gave me the badge out loud. "I'm Officer Frank Miller. I keep an eye on this neighborhood." And the way he said officer told me he thought the word required my chin to tip down. I said my name, Maya Washington, and offered a small smile because I was raised to give people a soft place to land, even when they come in hot. But he didn't want soft, he wanted surrender. So his eyes did that slow climb down my face to my shoulders, to the hem of my dress, not appreciation, appraisal. And he said it again, rules, standards, how we do things here, like I was late to a seminar he was teaching from my lawn. I told him I'd been busy with movers and the coffee maker and that I'd meet folks once I could find the forks, and he tilted his head and gave me a classroom smirk. "Too busy for courtesy," he said. "That's an attitude, and somehow the word attitude did all the lifting for the words he didn't say. And if you've ever been sized up by a man who believes your existence is a problem to be corrected." Yeah, that happened. Windows shifted. You always notice the window's first curtains pulling back like small tides. The guy across the street suddenly fascinated by a hubcap that didn't need that kind of attention. And the air got tight, not because it was hot, but because everyone on Silver Oak Lane knew his temper, like, you know, a dog that bites. I tried to land the plane. "Beautiful street," I said, happy to be here. But he stepped onto my lawn without asking the way people do when they think your boundary is an opinion, hands on hips breath. That reminded me of stale coffee and a long night of being wrong. And he lifted a finger like I was in detention. Rule number 1. And he didn't even finish before my patience got quiet and still, because some of us learned long ago that stillness is not surrender, it's aim. I told him I wasn't apologizing for asking him to respect my space and turned toward the porch because I was done auditioning for a role I never wanted, and that turn was gasoline. He grabbed my arm, his fingers finding skin through the thin fabric and leaving that deep throb that blooms under the surface. "You don't walk away from me," he said, voice dropping into that register men use when the audience's fear lesson hasn't started, and he dragged me toward the oak like he was in charge of the stage and I was the prop. He had a coil of rope in his cargo shorts pocket. Yes, rope in his pocket on a sunny Saturday, and if that sentence makes your stomach go cold, then you and I already understand each other. And he shoved me against the trunk and went around my waist with practiced movements, quick loops, a knot that pulled tight with a bite that made the dress say hello to bark. And he stepped back to admire it like cruelty was art. Now you think he said, arms crossed, chest lifted, think, where everyone can see what happens when you disrespect law and order on my street. And he did not have to say what he meant because the words he had already used, standards, attitude, respect for your betters, were a script I've heard since I learned how to be both polite and unbreakable. I kept my chin level and my eyes on the clean white of my front door. Not because I wanted him to think I was soft, but because I didn't intend to give him the currency he wanted, tears and trembling and a public apology to his ego. And I cataloged the crimes with the calm that scares men like him: assault, unlawful detention violation, under color of law, public humiliation as a weapon. His voice circling me like a vulture and the block holding its breath because fear here had tenure. Then my phone buzzed, a little vibration tucked in a side pocket at my thigh, and his eyes snapped to it like a cat seeing something move. "Who you calling?" he said like a taunt. "Local PD is my house," and he yanked it free, hurled it down to the asphalt and ground his heel across it until the screen was confetti, and he looked up like he'd cut my last lifeline and finally taught me the lesson. But he didn't know what he had just turned on. He didn't know that sometimes the worst thing a bully does is push the wrong button. See, that phone wasn't standard issue, it was a custom build for a very specific kind of bad day, and it carried a buried protocol for when your voice won't carry and your minutes are measured by someone else's temper. Screen fracture plus pressure pattern equals a burst compressed and encrypted hopping past local networks to a frequency that doesn't ask for permission, delivering a code and a location that lands with a thud on a map in a room full of people whose job is to listen for the worst line you never want to draw. I stood there with rope cutting into my breath and felt something in my chest lower from my throat to where it belonged. Not because help makes you brave, but because it lets you use the bravery you were already holding, and a strange quiet washed over the street, the kind you feel right before a storm changes the temperature. The first sign was sound, a low whump that you feel in your ribs before your ears. The second was geometry, 6 black Suburbans making a letter you can't spell, but you can understand. 2 locking the entrance, 2 the exit, and 2 gliding to a stop. So clean in front of my house it felt like choreography, doors opening in unison, agents stepping out in black with that unnerving efficiency that says we practice until we don't need to shout, perimeter blooming across grass, laser dots flicking across his chest like brief thoughts before disappearing. A man in a suit stepped out of the lead vehicle, not loud, not large, just centered, and his eyes did a sweep that took in the glittering glass of my broken phone, the rope kissing the fabric at my waist, the neighbor with the beer going warm in his hand, and the small man who had built a kingdom on my block and was about to find out what jurisdiction really means. Asset is visual, he said into a mic. I barely saw. Hostile identified, secure the asset, and 2 agents flowed toward me, 1 blade and 1 hand, the blade at my side to free me, the hand at my elbow to steady me. And the question was simple. Ma'am, injuries, and my answer was true. Scrapes. I'm fine because the worst hurt hadn't been physical. It was the kind that tries to edit your dignity, and when the rope fell away, it felt like sound returned. Frank Miller finally tried to stand back up inside his badge, hand drifting to the holster like a bad habit. This is my scene, he shouted over rotor wind as 2 helicopters came low enough to stir the leaves into a frenzy. Local matter, you have no jurisdiction. And the man in the suit turned to him without moving anything but his gaze, and said in a tone you use when explaining gravity to someone who doesn't believe in falling, "You unlawfully detained and assaulted a private citizen and humiliated her under color of law. Your jurisdiction ended the moment you tightened that knot, and 30 rifles did the rest of the talking without a word." Neighbors became witnesses in the space of a breath. Phones out, curtains opening, the man with the hose finally letting it fall so water pooled at his shoes while he filmed. And a woman 2 doors down stepped onto her lawn like it weighed 100 pounds and said into her own phone camera, "He's done this before." And fear, which had been the HOA president, suddenly lost the vote. The team formed a circle around me, not to trap, to protect, blanket over my shoulders, even in the heat, a bottle of water pressed into my hand. And that's when the man in the suit, Agent Thorne, said the line that snapped something inside the small kingdom forever. "Officer Miller, do you know who you assaulted?" And he didn't wait for an answer. He looked at me with eyes that held both duty and a kind of personal promise and said, "This is Maya Washington," and turned back, daughter of Director Michael Evans of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And I watched the words hit him like a cold wave, his knees almost folding because men like him don't plan for the day. The person they chose has a last name that makes the phone ring in rooms they'll never enter. Here's the twist you might argue about later. Yes, my father is the director. Yes, the device I carry has a protocol most people will never need. And yes, the cavalry arrived faster than you think possible. But none of that changes what he did. None of that makes my dignity negotiable. None of that makes the neighbor's fear imaginary. And if your first thought is that justice showed up because of a title, maybe that's the point. Maybe the part we should argue about is why some calls get answered with sirens and some get lost under paperwork. And maybe the new world we build has room for both truth and procedure, both outrage and reform. They arrested him with a gentleness that made it more devastating, writes. Read in a voice so steady it sounded like a level badge unpinned and dropped into a crinkling evidence bag that made his authority look like cheap jewelry. Gun cleared, bagged chain of custody labels clicking into place with the precision of a metronome. And when they walked him toward the SUV and dipped his head so he didn't hit the frame, I watched the neighbors lean forward in the same motion. Not to gloat, but to breathe for the first time, because a bully's magic dissolves in daylight, misses. Gable, the lace curtains, crossed the sidewalk with her phone held high and her voice trembling, and she said, "He told my son he'd plant something if we didn't stop parking on the street." And the man with the hose said, "He made me pay $500 for a ticket that wasn't real." And a teenager who had been a shadow on his porch became a witness on his driveway and said, "He stopped me for walking while Black and the agents wrote it all down, while evidence techs picked glittering glass from the asphalt and slid the rope into a bag that would sit under bright lights later with a tag that proves nobody touched it twice." When the noise settled into a hum and the helicopters lifted like heavy dragonflies and tilted away, the street sounded new, not quiet. The way fear makes quiet, but quiet like the first minute after the storm. And Agent Thorne handed me a secure phone and said, "Your father is on the line," and I moved to the shade of the porch where the wood still smelled like summer and said, "I'm all right." And he exhaled in that way fathers do, and he was angry because he loves me, and proud because he knows the training. He drilled into me became muscle memory, and he told me external investigators were already inbound to pry open every complaint attached to Miller's name and to dig out the rot from the department that kept stamping the paperwork no action. And then he told me to drink water, which made me laugh and made everything loosen an inch. After the black cars left with the loudest problem in the back seat, people lingered on porches, like the neighborhood had to relearn its face, and the agents in suits moved slow and patient, cross-checking stories, syncing video timestamps, leaving behind business cards with contact numbers that answer past 5 p.m. And Mrs. Gable brought me iced tea so cold it sweat into my palm, and she asked me if I could forgive the quiet, and I told her what I believe. That he built his control by making each of you think you were alone, and today you weren't. So whether you call that forgiveness or just momentum, I'll take it. I walked back to the oak after sunset and ran my hand along the bark where the rope had pressed itself into the day, and I felt nothing but steadiness because the tree didn't hurt me, he did, and he is gone, and what remains is a marker, the place where fear blinked. I sat on my steps with a mug of tea that was more about warmth than flavor and listened to crickets and finally let my shoulders drop, and I told myself something I needed to hear out loud, that this house is mine, this block is mine, I am not a guest here, I am not a problem to be corrected. I am exactly what my first name means when I let it ring in my own chest. I am Maya, and I will not move small. You want a neat ending, I get it. You want the press conference and the sentence and the headline that says justice like it's a full stop. But life is commas and dashes, not periods. And the real ending is a process that takes place in rooms without cameras where policies change and supervisors who looked away get asked why. And a young officer who watched today from behind a screen door decides whether to keep a job that asks him to ignore his conscience or to tell the truth and risk the cold shoulder in the locker room. And maybe the controversial part is this. Some of you are mad that help came so fast for me because of who my father is, and I hear you. And I won't argue your math, but I will say this. The standard should be protection, not privilege. The fix is to raise the floor, not lower the ceiling. The right thing is for every smash of a phone and every knot in a rope to trigger the same thunder. And if my story helps you insist on that, wherever you live, then today wasn't just about one street. Before I cut this camera, I'm going to ask for something because stories don't heal if they only live with the person who lived them, and justice doesn't learn if it only listens in rooms with seals on the wall. So tell me. When the convoy turned onto my street, what did you feel? Relief, anger, satisfaction, unease. Did it make you think about a day when authority swung like a hammer instead of a tool, when someone in your world tied dignity to a tree just to see if they could? And did you stay quiet or step forward? And if you stayed quiet, then would you do the same now? And if you stepped forward, what did it cost? And would you pay it again? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Argue the edge cases. Tell me where you draw the line between a bad day with a badge and a crime under color of law. Tell me what you've seen on your block, who your Mrs. Gable is, what your hubcap man ignored, what your oak looks like. And if this hit something true, share it with the person who still believes silence is safety. Hit like so the algorithm doesn't hide the conversation, subscribe so we can keep telling stories that insist on better, and tell me where you're watching from because I want to know how far this street goes. You know what I mean.